Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Shi. I'm a monitoring and evaluation advisor working with Joanna and Mohit on the BHA M&E team. So today we will be talking about the indicator performance tracking table, or the IPTT, the performance indicator reference sheets, and then the qualitative inquiry planning sheets as well. And this is all to dig a little bit deeper into the components that have already been covered by our colleagues this morning, and to inform your planning. So we'll be starting with the IPTT objectives. So hopefully at the end of this session, we can understand what is an IPTT and the purpose, become familiar with the template that we'll be using, and also become familiar with specific information requirements to complete an IPTT. As you wrote in your responses, the IPTT is really a core component of the monitoring and evaluation plan. It helps us identify and track benchmarks for success, to hierarchically organize measures leading to outcomes in the theory of change. It organizes our information and feeds into reporting, and overall it helps to tell the story of our activity. Okay, so the IPTT is touched upon at various phases throughout the RFSA. It's developed during the startup and refinement phase. It's used throughout the activity's life for regular monitoring, analysis, evaluation, and reporting. And it can also be updated as needed annually. So at the annual report stage and prior to the prep, and then also adjusted based on an analysis of whether or not it helps to better understand the theory of change and whether they're sufficient to track performance. And then it's also reported on annually and at baseline and endline. So a little bit more on the IPTT submission and approvals process, and what is required. The initial submission is required post-award alongside the monitoring and evaluation plan. And you can consult your agreement for the exact timing, but it generally goes along with the M&E plan. And as I said before, it can be updated and submitted twice annually. So with the annual report, in this report, you can provide 3 out-year targets, but no current fiscal year target changes are allowed. And also with the annual M&E plan submission prior to the prep submission. And as I said before, the IPTT can be revised at any time except for the current fiscal year's targets, and submitted at any time. So these target changes should be discussed prior to the submission with the AOR and with the BHA M&E advisor. So what's included in the IPTT? This has all of the quantitative indicators, including each indicator's baseline value, targets, and actuals. It includes indicators to monitor environmental impacts, including custom indicators. And this will be discussed more in the session focused on that tomorrow. And it has basically 4 tabs. And we'll go more in detail for these, but it has a LogFrame tab, a baseline and final evaluation tab, a performance monitoring tab, and then a tab for archived indicators. The first tab is the LogFrame. And as Mohit and Joanna described before, this is where you outline the goal, purposes, sub-purposes, intermediate outcomes, and outputs that are outlined in the theory of change. And this will be where all of your indicators are, including qualitative indicators. The second tab is for your baseline and endline evaluation indicators. So these will include the actual values and the targets for all of these indicators. And the third tab is for your monitoring indicators. So these are all of the indicators that are annually reported and includes the targets and life of award actuals and targets for those as well. And the last tab is for archived indicators. So these are intended to keep track of indicators that you may determine are no longer necessary. And that will be maintained as a record here. Just a note that the data from these archived indicators should still be kept in the baseline, endline, and monitoring tabs, but this is where the justification will be provided for any archiving that's been done. So over the next 3 slides, I'll be going a little bit more in detail on what the baseline, endline, and monitoring tabs look like, and the structure of those in the IPTT. The first column would be the indicator numbers. So these should appear in the order that they are in the log frame. And just a note that when an indicator is deleted, the number is not replaced, and it should remain the same. This will be where you reflect on each indicator's data collection methods, so whether it's population-based survey, routine monitoring, or participant-based surveys. The indicator, so the indicator title, which should match the log frame and should be the same as any standard indicators that have been provided from BHA and the mission. The indicator type, whether it's a BHA, mission, EMMP, environment, or custom indicator developed. And then the data source, so how was the information collected and from whom? The direction of change, so whether you're seeking an increase or a decrease. For instance, for prevalence of stunting, the direction of change would be negative. The base value that's required, so typically for output level indicators, it would be a 0 base value, and outcome indicators would have non-zero base values. And then here is where you would further describe the data sources and the collection. And a target which is required for each fiscal year and for the life of award for each indicator. And any comments that you may have on the target. The actual values, and then the percentage of the difference achieved, which is the difference between the actual and the target. And that also links with the following column, which is the deviation narrative. So when actual results reported are 10% above or below the target, this is where you'll need to provide an explanation of why there was this difference between the actual and the targets. And also any disaggregates, which should be outlined in the PIRs for all the indicators. Some common challenges that we've seen in other IPTTs are indicators can be missing data, disaggregates may not be calculated correctly, or they're missing, or the deviation narratives aren't adequately accounting for over or underachievement of that 10%. And then also some issues with indicator numbering and naming, and these are just some things to keep in mind as you develop your IPTT or start to this afternoon. So next I'll talk a little bit about the different reference sheets that we use. The PIRs are used for quantitative indicators, and the QUIPs, or the qualitative inquiry planning sheets, are for our qualitative monitoring and surveys. So the objectives of this session are to understand what PIRs and QUIPs are, understand the purpose of having these reference sheets, knowing how to create them for custom indicators, and then understanding the requirements for contextualizing the BHA standard PIRs and QUIPs. Thanks. So these are the reference sheets are basically building blocks. So they define very clearly for each indicator how it should be calculated, disaggregated, identify what the data collection methods and contextualizations are, and the frequency. And PIRs and QUIPs are required to be able to effectively collect and interpret all of the values for each of the indicators in the IPTT. So what is a PIRs specifically? It's a working monitoring and evaluation document that's provided in a standard format, and it explicitly defines a single quantitative indicator so that each reader understands what's being measured, exactly how to collect it, and the descriptions are detailed enough so that basically anyone can use the PIRs to be able to derive the indicator's value and to be able to design the data collection tool using only the PIRs. And the PIRs' purpose is to assure that indicator reporting is also accurate and consistent across time and location. So this is just an example of the standard template that we use at BHA, and this is how in the indicator handbooks for both the baseline and endline indicators, as well as the monitoring indicators, are organized. And this is also the template that you'll need to use if you decide to develop any custom indicators. And we'll go more into detail for each section here too. So within the PIRs, you'll need to include, of course, the indicator number, the title, which should clearly convey what the value represents. And these should match with the wording on the log frame. And then provide data source. In the definition section of the PIRs template, this will be where you define all the keywords, terms, and phrases that are relevant to that indicator, define all of the raw data that will be used to collect or calculate the indicator results, and then include any specific questions that may be asked in a data collection module or tool, as well as define the criteria for what needs to be counted. This helps to ensure that consistent data is collected, as I mentioned before, and provides the actual listen checklists for the data collectors when they're collecting the raw data. Just a note here that this is not where specifically the justification is provided for whether an indicator is included in an IPTT. The PIRs is also where the life of award guidance is described. So this determines how the value is calculated, and this can be done in a variety of ways, including as a sum, excuse me, as a sum of annual values, direct summation of annual new disaggregates or unique numbers, which are arrived at without double counting. And then the calculation, so how the actual raw data will be used to be calculated, whether that's through simple sums, sums above or below a threshold, a ratio, a means, a proportion. And this is where formulas and definitions will be clarified as well. And measurement notes. So how is the data actually collected? Who is collecting it? from whom are you collecting the data, what's the method, and then what's the frequency. And for every custom indicator, each section of the PIRs needs to be filled, even for context and for qualitative indicators. And for data collectors or recorders, these are the lists of people who might be directly responsible for collecting or recording the data. For example, your field project monitors, agricultural extension workers, M&E officers, or other staff members. And then the sampling frame from whom you're collecting the information. And then the method. So whether it's collected through population-based survey, participant-based survey, or routine monitoring. And then frequency of data collection. So you can see here some examples of what you might put in that column. And frequency of reporting, which may not necessarily be the same as the frequency of data collection. So for example, if training data is collected monthly because there are monthly trainings, it may only be reported quarterly or annually. And for baseline end line indicators, this would be the frequency would be at baseline and final evaluation. And then to contextualize the BHA standard PIRs that are provided in the indicator handbooks, partners are not supposed to change the core definition or meaning of a BHA or mission indicator. If the meaning of the indicator substantially changes, then it will become a custom indicator actually, and should be labeled as a custom indicator. Some examples of ways that partners have used a BHA indicator to come up with a custom indicator is, for instance, by converting a baseline endline indicator into a monitoring indicator, changing the sampling frame or from whom the data is collected to activity beneficiaries from population-based. But each custom indicator PIRs will require all of this information. And these are just some examples of different keywords that you may need to expand upon more when developing the custom indicator PIRs. So just to touch a little bit upon the BHA requirements for submission of the PIRs, if you're developing customized baseline indicator PIRs, these are due, the drafts are due 2 weeks before the baseline workshop begins. And then the final PIRs for these custom indicators will be due 14 days from the end of the baseline workshop. So now we'll talk a little bit about the QUIPs, and it basically outlines the plans and methods for qualitative monitoring, as you'll be describing in the monitoring strategy and log frames. Great. So as I mentioned before, the QUIPs are basically the PIRs for the qualitative indicators. And these will allow you to outline your plans and the methodologies for any qualitative monitoring. It's mandatory for all qualitative monitoring, but it's not used for formative studies and researches conducted during the refinement phase. We'll go through in the future slides about the template as well. And just one important distinction is between the qualitative monitoring, is the distinction between qualitative monitoring and qualitative studies. Qualitative monitoring is done more regularly, and qualitative studies are sort of done at one critical point in time. Thank you. And this is a example of the template. You can see that it's pretty similar to the PIRs, and asks for the different methodologies, the data analysis plan, and different limitations as well. So just to go through really quickly about the different sections, you'll first indicate whether it's a qualitative study or a qualitative monitoring. The numbering should match whatever is provided in the log frame. Under the purpose and objectives, you'll describe how the information collected will inform programming and decision making and why it's important to collect this information, what you're interested in studying, who the targeted impact group or population of interest is, where it will be conducted, and any high-level research and inquiry questions that will allow you to define the study and monitoring. And similar to the PIRs, this is where you'll also talk about the data sources, the sampling strategy, etc. I think it goes into more detail and yes, also the data analysis plan, any disaggregations that you'll be using for conducting the data collection, and how you plan to use it.